Greetings mga ka-spacers! Marahil ay napapansin ninyo na karamihan sa mga famous astronomers, astronauts, space scientists ay puro mga kalalakihan. Pero hindi nyo ba alam na may mga kababaihan din na nagbahagi para sa progress ng astronomy and space science? Ngayon kung gusto nyong malaman kung sino-sino yung mga kababaihan na nagbahagi ng kanilang talento sa progress ng astronomy and space science, tumutok po kayo sa ating programang Space, the Final Frontier. Tara na, and let's go where no man has gone before.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone.
There she is, NASA's Voyager 1, launched in 1977.
But that's just very small potatoes compared to what the Earth is involved with and knows about.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Greetings mga ka-spacers and welcome to Space, the Final Frontier. This is your ka-spacer, Professor Jun Cajigal. Now, Space, the Final Frontier is a series of online lectures that is intended to inspire our students out there and kayo po mga ka-spacers to love the sciences, especially astronomy. Now, in this episode, episode 9, we will be giving tribute to the women in astronomy and space science since we celebrate National Women's Month 2021. So we will be giving tribute to the women who gave significant contributions to astronomy and space science. So let us listen now to this lecture, and if you have any questions or comments or reactions, please feel free to type in your comments or your questions in the chat box. Wag po kayong mahiya and we would glad to answer all your questions. Please like and share this episode para makarating po sa mga estudyante na gustong mag-aral ng siyensya. So tara na and let's listen to this lecture on the women in astronomy and space science. Greetings and good day mga ka-spacers, and welcome to this special episode of Space, the Final Frontier, focusing on the women of astronomy and space science. Now, women have long played a very active, although sometimes overlooked role in astronomy, space science, and space travel. This lecture highlighted only several of these amazing women astronomers and astronauts. But this lecture is dedicated to the many more women throughout history who have deepened our understanding of the universe. So let us begin with the contribution of Hypatia. Now, Hypatia was a respected Egyptian academician at Alexandria's University who lectured in mathematics and astronomy, previously a male-only occupation. And she was, in her time, the world's leading mathematician and astronomer, the only woman whom such claim can be made. So yan mga ka-spacers, ang galing talaga ni Hypatia. Nung panahon niya kasi hindi masyadong nire-recognize at kinikilala ang mga female mathematicians and astronomers in spite of the fact that she was the world's leading mathematician and astronomer, the only woman whom such claim can be made. So ayan po ang contribution ni Hypatia. Also, we have to consider the contribution of Caroline Herschel. She was the so-called comet hunter. Now, Caroline Herschel was a German astronomer who created extensive catalogs of the night sky and became the first woman to discover a comet. And for your information mga ka-spacers, she was born as the younger sister of William Herschel, the discoverer of Uranus. She helped William in his observations, but she was also an astronomer in her own right, using her telescope to discover nebulae and comets. Caroline also discovered 8 comets within her lifetime, becoming the first woman to discover comets.
During the late 1700s, William Herschel, along with the help of his sister Caroline, made systematic and methodical observations of the night sky that would forever change the way the world sees the heavens.
Following
Herschel undertakes this systematic sweep, as he called it, of the entire heavens. He does this several times. And that's where his lucky break comes in. He discovers a planet, the planet Uranus.
With this discovery and his organized observations, some believe Herschel is the father of modern astronomy. But behind all his endeavors was his sister.
His sister Caroline, she was one of his true secret weapons in achieving his insights. Because she helped him organize his research. She helped him get interested in things. She was very much an independent thinker, but she was devoted to facilitating his work.
William Herschel's work wasn't always stargazing. He started out in a very different field.
Herschel is a musician. He's a clarinet player, he's an impresario, he's a composer, he's an organist. But his real passion isn't music, it's astronomy.
As amateur astronomers, the siblings relied on a do-it-yourself approach. Together, in a workshop at the rear of their house, they crafted homemade telescopes. At the heart of each telescope was a mirror made from a metal disc.
He'd take this disc and a grinding tool, and he'd work away, hollowing this disc out, working steadily towards the ideal parabolic shape that he wanted, so that the light as it came down would bounce off this mirror and come back to a perfect focus. He'd be working away, turning this disc round, but all the time keeping hands-on contact. While he was doing this, poor Caroline would have to entertain him and feed him.
By way of keeping him alive, I was constantly obliged to feed him by putting the victuals by bits into his mouth. This was once the case when, at the finishing of a 6-inch mirror, he had not left his hands from it for 16 hours.
It was with these homemade telescopes that Herschel, in March of 1781, discovered Uranus. In doing so, he changes not only the known solar system, but his life as well.
The planets have been identified since the dawn of written astronomy. And then suddenly you have this clarinet player, with homemade telescopes in his back garden. He discovers another one. The thing is utterly astonishing. So he suddenly becomes a celebrity.
William's discovery brings him a pension from King George III. Caroline is also recognized for her work and becomes the first professional woman astronomer. Together, with their newfound fame, the Herschels embark on an ambitious plan. They construct the world's largest telescope and use it to survey the entire sky.
The program that Herschel has of building giant telescopes, of using them to work out the large-scale structure of the universe, which is, of course, the basic program of modern astronomy, and Herschel does invent that.
Herschel may deserve credit as a founder of modern astronomy, but he was not alone in his discoveries.
He was a great observer, a great instrument builder, and a great planner of scientific agenda, but he also had a great sister.
So ayan mga ka-spacers, now you know, may katandem pala si William Herschel. So we know from our history that William Herschel discovered Uranus. So si William Herschel pala ay may astronomer na kapatid. At yan ay si Caroline Herschel. So, astronomer din siya and she discovered nebulae and several comets within her lifetime. So, ang galing talaga ang mag-utol na to na si William Herschel and si Caroline Herschel na tinatawag na Comet Hunter. So another woman who gave a significant contribution to astronomy was Nancy Roman. She is the so-called the mother of the Hubble Space Telescope. Now Nancy Roman played a major part in the planning of the Hubble Space Telescope, and she was the first woman to hold an executive position at NASA. At age 11, Nancy set up a school astronomy club where she and her friends would learn about constellations, sparking her interest in an astronomy career. After being fast-tracked through high school, she gained a degree and then a PhD in astronomy. She worked for a while as a researcher and then eventually applied to become the first chief of astronomy in 1959 at NASA. Her appointment made her the first woman to hold an executive position within the space agency. So ayan po mga kasyensya, ayan po yung advantage pag sumali tayo sa isang astronomy club. So kagaya ng Vedan Society of Young Astronomers, pag sumali kayo, you get inspired to love the sciences, especially astronomy. And who knows, you might pursue a career in astronomy kagaya na nangyari kay Nancy Roman. Alright, then Nancy set up the committee for the Hubble Space Telescope and was highly involved in the telescope's planning and design, which is why she is now often referred to as the mother of the Hubble Space Telescope. Upon retiring from NASA in 1979, she continues to be a spokesperson and an advocate for women in science. So, ang galing talaga ni Nancy Roman. So yan mga kasyensya, hindi natin nakalain na ang promotor ng Hubble Space Telescope ay isa palang babae. And that is Nancy Roman, the mother of the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, another woman who gave significant contributions in the field of space science was Katherine Johnson. Siya po ay na-feature dun sa film na Hidden Figures. Now, Katherine studied how to use geometry for space travel. She figured out the paths for the spacecraft to orbit the Earth and to land on the moon. NASA used Katherine's mathematics and it worked. NASA sent astronauts into orbit around the Earth. So mga ka-spacers, konting background kay Katherine Johnson. So nung panahon niya, ng mga late 50s to early 60s, may discrimination between the black Americans and the whites. And nung panahon niya ay dinedevelop pa ang computer. So Katherine used her skills in mathematics to figure out the paths for the spacecraft to orbit the Earth. And did you know mga ka-spacers, Katherine Johnson was responsible for the success of John Glenn's orbit around the Earth. And did you know mga ka-spacers that Katherine Johnson used her mathematics skills to help send astronauts to the moon and back? So, ang lupit talaga. So, wala pang computers noon or dinedevelop pa yung computers noon. And using her mathematics skills, Katherine Johnson was able to figure out the trajectory of the Apollo spacecraft to the moon and back to Earth. NASA could not have done these things without the help of Katherine Johnson. Now, aside from Katherine Johnson, another black American woman who was featured in that movie Hidden Figures was Dorothy Vaughan. She was an African American mathematician and human computer who worked for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics or NACA and at NASA at Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia. In 1949, she became acting supervisor of the West Area Computers, the first African-American woman to supervise a staff at the center. And did you know mga ka-spacers that during her 28-year career, Vaughan prepared for the introduction of machine computers in the early 1960s by teaching herself and her staff the programming language of Fortran. She later headed the programming section of the Analysis and Computation Division or ACD at NASA Langley. So mga ka-spacers, aside kay Catherine and Dorothy, meron pang isang Black American woman that was featured in the movie Hidden Figures. And siya ay si Mary Jackson. Mary Jackson was an African-American mathematician and aerospace engineer at the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics or NACA, which in 1958 was succeeded by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration or NASA. She worked at Langley Research Center in Hampton, Virginia for most of her career. She started as a human computer at the Segregated West Area Computing Division at NASA. So magkakasama to sila Catherine, si Dorothy at si Mary Jackson. She took advanced engineering classes and in 1958 she became NASA's first black female engineer. So ayan mga ka-spacers, meet the women from the movie Hidden Figures. So kung hindi sa kanilang mga contributions, hindi magiging successful ang manned space program ng NASA. So napakalupit nila talaga. These are the so-called human computers ng NASA noon, yung mga early 60s. And kung hindi dahil sa kanilang contribution, hindi tayo makakapagpadala ng astronauts sa buwan. So isn't that fascinating indeed?
One story that had been lost to history is about the so-called human computers. They are a group of women, many of them black, who helped put a man on the moon. Their intellect was an essential part of America's ability to launch rockets into space. But Jan Crawford shows us how they were relegated to just a footnote in history until now.
5, 4, 3, 2.
It was a race to secure America's future at the forefront of space.
We have liftoff.
Fueled by men brave enough to travel where no one had gone before.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
What?
The astronauts were superstars, the engineers the stuff of movie legend. But America's triumph in the space race was made possible by another group the country didn't see. They were called human computers, and they were women, many of them African American, hired by NASA to hand calculate propulsion, lift, thrust, and trajectory.
They had to make sure that the planes were safe, that the planes were fast, that they were efficient, that the astronaut not only went out into space, but that he came back safely.
I mean, this was life or death.
This is life or death. You know, this is the importance. You do the work right, you do it right the first time.
The daughter of a NASA scientist, Margot Lee Shetterly, was raised in Hampton, Virginia, the same town where these women once worked, a hidden history that had been staring her in the face.
It's not a first or an only story. It's a story of a group of women who were given a chance and who performed and who opened doors for the women who came behind them.
Shetterly's new book, Hidden Figures, and his upcoming movie,
What do you ladies do for NASA?
Calculate your launch and landing, sir.
is the story of how a small band of black women joined the space program in the 50s and the 60s, defying female stereotypes and challenging a segregated system.
I had no idea they hired.
There are quite a few women working in the space program.
One of those women was Katherine Johnson. On her 98th birthday, she still lives by the same motto her father told her when she was young.
You're as good as anybody here.
And you took that to heart?
Yeah, and you know worse. You know better.
At NASA, she calculated the trajectory of Alan Shepard's 1961 spaceflight, verified the numbers guiding John Glenn's orbit, and in 1969, her numbers helped the Apollo mission land on the moon.
There is no question that every single day, every number, every research report, everything that they did was also directed at expanding the concept of what was possible for people who looked like them.
Working in the Jim Crow South, these women were relegated to the back of the bus to get to work. They couldn't use the same bathrooms or sit at the same lunch tables. Langley's newly diverse workforce made it not just a flight laboratory, but a social experiment.
Do you think that there's something about math that it doesn't matter, it's the equalizer?
In math, when you're working with it, what you're doing is either right or it's wrong.
Leland Melvin started at NASA just a few years after Johnson retired.
Her name was actually spoken kind of like in reverence, like it's Katherine Johnson.
Melvin was an engineer and astronaut who flew on 2 space missions.
They were the barrier breakers that helped other people see that there were other opportunities at NASA. It takes a few people to establish a foothold, no matter what that foothold is.
This really is a story about the American dream. And I think
the struggle for the American dream,
as you put it. The struggle for the American dream. What I really hope this story does is fuse these different histories to the American dream. Just because the protagonists of this book are Black women does not mean that this is in any way less an American story.
For CBS This Morning, Jan Crawford, Hampton, Virginia.
Now, another remarkable woman astronomer who made her mark in the scientific community was Jocelyn Bell Burnell. She's the so-called pulsar discoverer. Jocelyn Bell Burnell discovered a new type of object called pulsars while working as a PhD research student. And while working towards her PhD, Jocelyn discovered the first pulsar. Now, what are pulsars anyway? Now, pulsars are rapidly spinning cores of dead stars or neutron stars that have a strong magnetic field. This magnetic field sends an intense beam of light from the poles of the pulsar, which can sweep across the direction of Earth, much like the beam from a lighthouse. That's why it's called a pulsar or pulsating stars. So mga ka-spacers, yung discovery ng pulsar ni Burnell ay napaka-significant. The discovery of the pulsar is considered as one of the greatest astronomical discoveries in the 20th century. Kaya lang, Jocelyn was not included in the Nobel Prize winners for this find. Some people see this as a slight on her gender. Now, however, in interviews, Jocelyn has always been positive about the Nobel Prize. She pointed out that at the time, Nobel Prizes were typically awarded to the senior academics in a group rather than research students such as she was. So, yun ang dahilan kaya hindi siya siguro nanalo ng Nobel Prize dun sa kanyang discovery ng pulsars. But nevertheless, we really acknowledge her for the discovery of pulsars.
That bit of the sky due to go through the telescope beam at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning. December the 21st, perishing cold. And I switched on the high-speed recorder and it came blip, 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 blip. Clearly the same family, the same sort of stuff. And that was great. That was really sweet. It finally scotched the little green men hypothesis, because it's highly unlikely there's 2 lots of little green men, opposite sides of the universe, both deciding to signal to a rather inconspicuous planet Earth at the same time, using a daft technique and a rather commonplace frequency. It has to be some new kind of star, not seen before. And that then cleared the way for us publishing, going public. Martin Ryle called up the editor of Nature, John Maddox, and more or less said, we've got something interesting coming. He didn't quite say hold the presses, but he nearly did.
Now, the people here say that if they got 3 signals as exactly spaced as that, it would be very unusual. If they got 4, it would be phenomenal. Well, they've had pulses as exactly spaced as that 24 hours of the day since November.
Well, these signals that we're picking up are entirely new. Nothing like this has been seen in radio astronomy before.
The excitement was because this was a totally unexpected, totally new kind of object, behaving in a way that astronomers had never expected, never dreamt.
So mga ka-spacers, yung susunod natin na woman astronomer, siguro narinig nyo na yung pangalan niya sa YouTube at siguro narinig nyo na rin yung kanyang pangalan sa mga documentaries na fini-feature sa National Geographic and Discovery Channel. Her name is Caroline Porco. She is a planetary scientist. Caroline Porco has shaped our understanding of the solar system thanks to her discoveries from the Voyager and the Cassini mission data. Now, Caroline became a member of the Voyager imaging team and tasked with the job of studying the images from the 2 Voyager probes. Ito yung Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. These probes visited the outer solar system for the first time. Voyager 1 flew by Jupiter and Saturn, and Voyager 2 flew by Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. So ito yung tinatawag natin na the grand tour of the outer planets of the solar system by Voyager 2. Caroline was key to the discovery of brand new features in Saturn's rings, including eccentric ringlets and spokes. These ringlets and spokes are connected to Saturn's magnetic field, a connection which Caroline had discovered.
I was a teenager during the 1960s when our country was leading the exploration of space. It just is remarkable to me that my own story turned out to be that I did the very same thing. I was chosen to be the team leader of the imaging team on the Cassini mission at Saturn. I felt like someone grabbed me by the hand and hauled me aboard this train that was headed for history. This put me in this wonderful position of being responsible for returning the visual record of our travels around Saturn that told of this story of our exploration. I wanted to make the images as captivating and as alluring as possible, so people would feel inspired by what we were doing and feel a connection to humanity's exploration of the solar system. We're seeing the rings. We're seeing eruptions from the surface of Enceladus. We're seeing liquids on the surface of Titan. This was the stuff of science fiction, but it was for real. It was really happening. This culminated in this idea I had to take a picture of the Earth seen from Saturn. I called it the day the Earth smiled. We announced it to the world ahead of time. Go out wherever you are, look up and smile at the sheer joy of being on a pale blue dot. Think about how unique it is in our solar system, how bursting forth with life our planet is. After spending 40 years of my life exploring other planets, I've come home, and what I've seen has told me just how special and precious our own planet is. We have to make sure children understand how precarious a situation the Earth is and make them feel empowered to change it. My name is Caroline Porco, and I think now the job is to be a guardian of our own planet.
So mga ka-spacers, yan si Caroline Porco dahil sa kanyang skills in analyzing the images na pinapadala ng Voyager 1 and 2 ay nadagdagan ang ating kaalaman about the outer planets of the solar system. Ngayon mga ka-spacers, kung mapapansin ninyo ay karamihan sa mga nababanggit natin na pangalan ay mga American astronomers or space scientists. Ngayon ang susunod ko na babanggitin ay isang Russian who made her mark in history. Her name is Valentina Tereshkova. She is the first woman in space. And on June 16, 1963, aboard the Vostok 6 spacecraft, Soviet cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova becomes the first woman to travel into space. After 48 orbits and 71 hours, she returned to Earth, having spent more time in space than all U.S. astronauts combined to that date.
After cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space in 1961, Director of Cosmonaut Training Nikolai Kakamin read in an American media source that female pilots in the U.S. were training to become astronauts. As a result, Kakamin gained approval for an all-female cosmonaut program, which began training in 1963. Born on March 6, 1937, textile worker Valentina Tereshkova had no previous desire to fly in space. However, her love of skydiving made her an excellent candidate for the Soviet space program. Training included isolation tests, centrifuge G-force tests, thermo-chamber tests, decompression chamber tests, and pilot training in MiG-15 fighter jets. On June 16, 1963, Tereshkova reached outer space in her Vostok 6 rocket after a flawless liftoff. Although she experienced nausea and physical discomfort for most of the flight, she orbited the Earth 48 times in just under 3 days, making her the first and only woman to solo in space. As was the protocol in all Vostok missions, Tereshkova ejected from her capsule during its descent at about 4 miles above the Earth, parachuting to the ground in Kazakhstan on June 19, 1963. After the dissolution of the first group of female cosmonauts in 1969, Tereshkova stayed on at the Soviet space program as an instructor, graduating from the Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy and retiring from the Air Force in 1997, having attained the rank of Major General. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Tereshkova was elected in 2011 to the National State Duma, much like the American House of Representatives, re-elected for a second term in 2016.
So ayan mga ka-spacers, si Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space. Then also we have Peggy Whitson, siya isang NASA American astronaut. She first flew to space in 2002 where she spent 6 months, that's equivalent to 184 days, on the International Space Station or ISS. Peggy returned to the ISS in 2007, staying even longer, around 191 days. After returning, Peggy became the first female chief of the astronaut office at NASA. And in April of 2017, Peggy broke the record for the longest time in space of any American astronaut with a cumulative total of 534 days in space. She recently returned to Earth on September 3 of 2017 with a total time in space of 665 days. Grabe, ang lupit. More than a year siya sa space. So that's Peggy Whitson, a NASA astronaut.
was 9 years old when the first guys walked on the moon, and our folks put us to bed relatively early, but woke us back up so that we could watch that. But I thought, wow, cool job. I had a great mom who encouraged me to do whatever I wanted. I said something about being an airline pilot. And my sister said, you can't be an airline pilot. You can only be the flight attendant. My mom said, no, that's not true. You can be whatever you want. It wasn't until I graduated high school in 1978 when they selected the first female astronauts that I think becoming an astronaut really became a goal of mine. Of course, Sally Ride was influential in developing my image of what a female astronaut was. It became much more motivating to see that there were women there, that women could do this job. I didn't tell a lot of people that that's what I wanted to do because I thought, you know, they'd think I was just dreaming something that's not even possible. Bob Cabana, who was chief of the astronaut office at the time, called me. And so I was expecting rejection, and he's trying to make small talk with me, and I'm like, I don't have time for this. Just tell me I didn't make it. But he's like, would you like to come and work for me? And I'm like, yes!
New residents headed for the International Space Station, Commander Valerie Korzun and flight engineers Peggy Whitson and Sergei Chestchov.
As a woman, doing spacewalks is more challenging, mostly because the suits are sized bigger than the average female. And yes, it is risky. You're going 17,500 miles an hour around the Earth. Some people have a sense that they're actually falling off of the station. I never had that sensation. I opened the hatch and I was just like, wow, I was like going out there so fast. It was so beautiful, so incredible. I was commander of the station, and then the second female shuttle commander actually arrived to this station, Pam Melroy. So we had the first two female commanders on orbit at the same time. One of the Russian bosses said it was because there were two women on board. And that was in spite of the fact that the previous crew, which was all male, had had the same problem. I've been on 3 selection boards now. We don't have enough applicants in the female categories. That's why one of the big pushes for NASA is this STEM education primarily focused on young girls, because we want more women to understand that, yes, you can do these jobs too. You just have to get the right education and training so that you can apply and make it happen.
I'm going to turn command of the International Space Station over to Dr. Peggy Whitson. She now becomes the first 2-time female commander of the International Space Station.
I've had great jobs at NASA, but the most satisfying job I've ever had is being a member of a crew on board the space station. Every day, every task, I felt like I was contributing to space exploration very directly, and it's one of the great wonders.
So mga ka-spacers, that's Peggy Whitson. Now mga ka-spacers, aside from holding the record for the longest time in space of any American astronaut, Peggy Whitson also holds the record for the oldest woman in space at age 57. Peggy Whitson also holds the record for the first woman to command the International Space Station or ISS, and the first woman to command it twice. Would you believe that, mga ka-spacers? And Peggy Whitson also holds the record for the most number of spacewalks by a female astronaut as of May 10 of 2017. So napakalupit talaga ni Peggy Whitson. So mga ka-spacers, nabanggit natin kanina si Valentina Tereshchuk ba being the first woman in space, and itong si Peggy Whitson. But the first woman American astronaut was Sally Ride. Sally Ride was the first American woman astronaut. Sally Ride was the first American woman to fly in space. In 1978, she finished her PhD in physics at Stanford University and simultaneously was selected as an astronaut candidate by NASA. Then, after 5 years of training, she finally flew on the Space Shuttle Challenger in 1983. Her flight came just less than a year after Svetlana Savitskaya became the second woman to fly to space. Sally Ride flew on the Challenger again in 1984.
Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, was born on May 26, 1951 in Los Angeles. She studied at Stanford University, earning a master's and PhD in physics, before beating out 1,000 applicants for a spot in NASA's astronaut program in 1978.
In the early years of NASA, the astronaut corps was chosen entirely from fighter pilots. When the shuttle program was initiated, NASA decided they wanted astronauts who had backgrounds in science, engineering, medicine, because they wanted to do experiments in space.
Sally Ride had a PhD in physics and so was in a perfect position to do a number of the science experiments that were being done on the space shuttle.
On June 18, 1983, flying aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, Sally Ride became America's first woman in space.
Sally Ride was a mission specialist for NASA. That's a type of astronaut who goes on the missions but doesn't fly the shuttle. She was a scientist. She ran experiments and deployed satellites.
In those days, it was perceived as unusual even to have a woman pilot, never mind an astronaut. So for her to actually become someone who flies into orbit on the Challenger craft was groundbreaking.
She was still, from the press, getting questions about, well, how do you think your female organs will respond to the space environment? Or do you get moody when things don't go right during training? So even in 1983, there were still, certain barriers, certain glass ceilings, and Sally Ride certainly shattered that glass ceiling.
Sally Ride flew 2 Challenger missions and was scheduled for a third, but this was canceled due to the tragic Challenger explosion on January 28, 1986.
Sally Ride left NASA in 1987 and was a science fellow at Stanford. Then she moved to University of California, San Diego, where she was a professor of physics.
Sally Ride did a tremendous amount to advance science education, in particular to attract young girls to science.
Sally Ride founded Sally Ride Science in 2001 to advance science education for young kids and authored 5 educational science books.
Her work on inspiring young people to go into science is especially important in America today. We need as many people as possible to get excited about helping America become competitive in a technical world.
Sally Ride will always be remembered as the first American woman in space, but I think her legacy is really the work that she did in education, in bringing the excitement of science, space exploration, to kids at the middle school level.
Sally Ride died in Los Angeles, California on July 23, 2012 from pancreatic cancer.
Sally Ride changed what it looked like to be an astronaut and made it possible for millions of girls in America to dream about going into space.
So ayan mga ka-spacers, so siguro bago tayo matapos sa ating programa, kailangan natin mabanggit ang contribution ni Jill Tarter. Jill Tarter was the co-founder of the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, also known as SETI. Tarter is one of the foremost researchers seeking to find life on other planets. Tarter has dedicated her life to exploring the mysteries of the cosmos. Her thirst for knowledge and tireless work have earned her numerous awards, including the Adler Planetarium Women in Space Science Award in 2003, 2 public service medals from NASA, a spot on Times Magazine 2004 list of the 100 most influential people in the world, and in 2005, the asteroid 74824 Tarter was named after her. So ang galing si Jill Tarter. She's the co-founder of the SETI Institute.
I'm trying to answer an old question, a question that's been asked by my ancestors and that most people on the planet are asking today. I am trying to figure out whether there's any other life beyond Earth. So I work on a project called SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. We have these tools called radio telescopes that will allow us to do some observations, some experiments. We're looking for signals at some frequency, some wavelength that don't look like what Mother Nature produces. If we find the signals, we are going to infer that at least at some time, there were some intelligent technologists around who built the technology transmitting those signals. I met Carl Sagan when I was a postdoctoral fellow in the mid-'80s. I was at a cocktail party at Carl Sagan's house, and Carl and Annie took me off in a corner and they said, "Carl is writing a science fiction book. You may think you recognize someone in the book, but I think you're like her." And I'm reading it and I'm going, what? That's me. So I was really taken aback. I said, look, here's the deal. As long as she doesn't eat ice cream cones for lunch, nobody's gonna think it's me. That was the thing that was sort of my most peculiar habit at the time. When Contact was turned into a film, I actually had a phenomenal opportunity to work a little with Jodie Foster. She wanted to do a very good job of portraying the scientist, particularly the female scientist, as a real human with passion, with obstinacy. She was a woman who was driven, who had a passion, who wanted to answer a question, and she would not give up. She's a fantastic role model for young girls because she actually has fun. And we usually forget to tell our young students. Being a scientist is a lot of work, but it's also wonderful fun. You get to solve puzzles, you get to figure out something that nobody else has figured out, and you never have to grow up. You never have to stop asking why. After the movie was released, I certainly became far more popular, right? I'm on everybody's speaker list, but it was also a way to try and begin the process of getting the world involved with looking for extraterrestrial intelligence. Now that it's been so many years, young scientists, graduate students, come up to me and say, I got interested in science because of that movie. That's my favorite movie. And so I get to interact with folks who say, yep, Contact. That's what did it for me.
So ayan mga ka-spacers, that's Jill Tarter. Ngayon marahil magtatanong kayo kung bakit puro mga dayuhan ang mga pangalan na nabanggit natin dito sa ating episode na Women in Astronomy and Space Science. So mga ka-spacers, siguro bago tayo magtapos, ay magbigay-pugay tayo kay Dr. Josette Bio. Si Dr. Josette Bio ay isang educator and a minor planet was named after her. Ito yung planet Bio or asteroid Bio. Itong asteroid 13241 is found in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. So ayan mga ka-spacers, itong asteroid 13241 or asteroid Bio was named after Dr. Josette Bio. So isn't that fascinating indeed? So ayan po mga ka-spacers, ayan po yung ating episode na Women in Astronomy and Space Science. So marami pa dyan, hindi pa natin nababanggit. So itong programa na to, itong episode na ito ay pagbibigay po guys sa mga kababaihan na nag-contribute sa progress ng astronomy and space science. So marami pong salamat sa inyong pakikinig at panonood dito sa ating programang Space, the Final Frontier. Shout out sa ating mga estudyante dyan na nakikinig ngayon. Shout out sa mga estudyante ko from 11 STEM and 12 STEM. Sa mga suki ko, mga ka-spacers na laging tumututok sa ating programa, maraming salamat po sa inyong pakikinig at panonood. At tumutok na lang po kayo dito. Kaysa manood kayo ng mga teleserye, dito na lang kayo tumutok sa ating programang Space, the Final Frontier. At marami pa ho kayong matututunan dito. So maraming salamat for watching. Always stay safe. This is your Kaspacer, Professor Jun Cajigal, saying, live long and prosper. And I will see you in our next episode of Space, the Final Frontier. Bye-bye and see you.
There she is. NASA's Voyager 1. Launched in 1977.
But that's just very small potatoes compared to what the Earth is involved with and knows about.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
To go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone.